5,000 years of urbanization, it only began to be solved in the mid 1800s. Previously, big cities are a death sentence for a society because they are a source of disease, they're a source of political unrest, they're a source of contamination, and even a source of corruption. So the point is, these things conspired to end major countries. And the uncanny history is like a movie that you know the answer to or the ending already. Every time a big city exists, within less than 100 years, that entire civilization is gone. It is gone. It is not just drop the city, but the whole thing collapses. The Roman Empire took a few centuries longer, but nonetheless, by the time Rome was around 1 million, it was already the empire. It lost its democracy. It's got increasingly corrupt and violent and cruel, and led to systemic revolutionary revolts all over the Roman Empire, which eventually was part of, and corruption in the army. It just was hard to keep everything together and to keep the population of the capital city fed as well. Increasing poverty, all of these big issues. As I say, there's three questions. One question is, what do you do with big cities? The other question I have, what do you do with economics? Economics of big cities. How do you keep people alive? And three, politics. Do you really want to allow people in the city to vote or to have a say in their lives? Or do you just want a police state? These were big issues for elites. And as big cities get larger and more destabilizing, revolutionaries like it and conservatives dislike it. And people in the middle get trapped with both those extreme solutions. But the point is, the challenge of the 21st century is this movie that we've already seen for 5,000 years is being repeated right now across developing countries after World War II. There are massive big cities, there are economic problems, there are political problems, and there are urban waste and handling problems. So those three issues, urban, politics, economics, it's the same movie again. But we are in a position now where we can solve all of these problems. The issue is political will. The issue is inventing solutions that fit a less economically wealthy situation. And I think it's possible to do that now. So I'll leave you on that optimistic note, but let's look at some of the ongoing tragedies. How many of you have ever seen a Greek tragedy? A Greek tragedy always starts out with the audience knowing what's going to happen. And that's the tragedy, that the actors on the stage don't know their fate, but the audience is allowed to know what's going to happen. So you and I are the audience of the Greek tragedy here. We're watching this urban play and we know the outcome already for 5,000 years. But that story totally changed in the 1850s, quite drastically, to a more optimistic outcome. But in some ways, there's two things. I want to say those challenges still exist in the 21st century, but I want to say every urban thing we solved for the last 150 years has created a massive environmental problem now. So our solutions, all of our previous solutions, actually, all they did was push the urban problems and the waste problems outside the city. We didn't really solve material handling. We solved it on one particular site. We made urban living sustainable and socially speaking, but not economically or not ecologically speaking. So the rise of super tech is really an urban-based solution structure exclusively for big city sites and big city infrastructures. And it just pushed a lot of waste somewhere else that hopefully somebody else would take care of. They hope nature would just take care of it. But now with so many big cities around the world, we're dealing with global systemic environmental problems. And it's going to require a huge rethinking of how we solve urban issues. And so on that theme, I'll address that right now really quickly, maybe in 10, 15 minutes, I hope. So I'll show these images. It's important to look forward. So growing infrastructural scale, this is a nice dramatic thing. This is built in 1880, and this was the largest building supposedly in the Southern Hemisphere. It doesn't look too big for us, but the way it's scaled, I've been there myself. This is in Melbourne, in Australia. It's a beautiful building with beautiful park grounds. It's made of wrought iron. There's no steel in this building. This is still being built in a world with no steel. It looks quite tremendous, right? Wood, beautiful. It still has this old European feel, yet very modern, large spaces. Looks quite tremendous, right? You see, here's the Australian kangaroos. This is my picture, actually. It's been made a World Heritage Site. Here's the Australian flag up there. But can you find that building? Where is that building? Do you see it? That's it today. You see what I mean? Look at the scale. I mean, if you lived 200 years, you would have seen this in your lifetime. But this is an astounding thing we don't normally think about. The scale of our lives has grown tremendously. Why? Because we've solved urban issues for the first time as a species. And solving that in one place allowed people to share those ideas around the world. But some of those ideas are so expensive, they haven't been able to be applied around the world. That's the issue. So we need to think about how we can make more effective solutions that are cheaper and more ecological than before. Of course, here's the building I just looked at down here. Tiny compared to just, right across that park. I mean, it looks massive, right? But it's small nowadays. This is a world of steel behind it. This is a world of wrought iron. Steel allowed us to build skyscrapers from the 1890s. Literally 1 decade later, that other kind of city began to be built. And that allowed more density, that allowed more urban handling problems, and many things like that. But in the United States now, there's 52 cities of over 1 million in population, and that's where they are. You may think, well, that's great. US is an urbanized place. But the point is, in world history of 5,000 years, this is bizarre. This is absolutely bizarre. For most of world history, there's been very limited urbanization. Why? Because we didn't solve those issues, because we now live in a world of huge debates on problem solving. Mostly because of that. Urbanizing change, let's review that change. Excuse me. So what is that? Most of the world history, limited urbanization, limited literacy, so limited problem solving, and limited communication. If you did solve something in one country, you didn't really translate that and share it in a journal, and everybody shared the idea. So if Constantinople solved one thing, it remained a solution in Constantinople and was not shared 200 years later anywhere. If Japan or, the cities of Mexico before European conquest, if they had solved waste problems, those ideas were not really applied or written about, excuse me, and shared. So these points changed drastically after around 1800, great big urbanization, expanding literacy, expanding communication, expanding numbers of people, and all those things interacted to make a new system that worked very hard to solve urban waste and urban living handling problems. So we live in a world of huge debates. And if you know anything about people, right, people don't always agree. So there is a huge desire to convince other people of your solution. And how do you do that? Well, you have to appeal to their logic. You can't just appeal to their emotions, but people were expecting some kind of economic return. They wanted to, how do we know your solution is going to work? More and more people were required to really bend toward empirical science to make their argument. So everybody from liberals to conservatives to revolutionaries, they're all appealing to science to solve these urban and economic problems. Excuse me. So I want to argue big cities and big city problems are historically rare. How rare? Let's look at all big cities globally, and let's look over the past 5,000 years. Also, this means I should define big cities. It's defined as cities of 1 million people or more. Let me close this. It's kind of a high contrast here. That's a little bit better. So I'll talk about several other themes later, but these themes can only be understood after you see this repeating Greek tragedy of what urban living was like for most of world history. So argue several interrelated points. Before the 1800s, major urbanization, deeper literacy have both been tiny and rare. This impacted how problem solving was conducted. So before the 1800s, such systemic analytical problem solving was only associated with a handful of state capitals. They weren't trying to solve any other problems, and only small numbers of state elites that are mostly married to each other. So literally a few thousand people at most ran most countries. That's about it. And this was worldwide. the way politics and big infrastructures were developed. Pardon me. If I drink more coffee, it'll make me worse. Anyway, thinking on, argue several points after the 1800s now, with wider urban scales. You had a lot of revolutions in Europe, particularly, that made nation states, but this goes back and forth in many countries. A lot of people didn't want a nation state, particularly the old elites. So there's lots of counter-revolutionary forces. France is on its 5th republic right now, because several of those republics were destroyed by the return of kings throughout the 1800s, particularly around 1815, 1848 was a fail, and 1870. So wider urban scales, greater political instability, widened literacy throughout this period, greater desires for participation, and increasing lack of elite agreement, because everybody's disagreeing. Like, how do we solve all these problems? If any of you know about the end of the Chosun dynasty, the same thing was happening in Korea in the 1880s, 1890s. The elites were not consolidated. There were some that supported Russia, some Japan, some supported Christians, even though it was illegal at the time. Nobody knew the correct way forward for Korea, and it led to a lot of instability, and you're taken over. You're easily taken over when your elites are not consolidated like that. So after 1800s, equally, particularly the widening literacy, sponsored by many national governments, combining with the above point about urban scale. And all this allowed an increasing number of people outside the government, like you and me, to have their free time and coordination for thinking and problem solving. So we begin to worry about, why isn't our local unelected government doing something about this problem? So we would petition, we would organize, we knew how to write. And that kind of dynamic kept the pressure up to make things and to make infrastructures more representative. An increasing number were also in dangerous slave-like urban industrial working conditions, where there's no regulations on health, no regulation on pollution and trash. There's no public transportation. People literally lived next to the factories where they worked, if we had lived in an industrial zone. There's no urban planning. There's no sewer systems. There's no electricity. And there's no organized garbage removal. You just dump it in the street. So people were living on a dump pile. And children's legs, particularly in England, people were becoming so malnourished, so unhealthy, that their legs were bending. Like, instead of legs looking like this, people look, their legs bent like this. They walk around, if this is their feet, that's called rickets. It's a vitamin D deficiency. No sunlight, no fresh food. Literally, people were buckling under their own body weight. And even the military was concerned in England. Like, we can't fight a war if our country is allowed to destroy the biological population itself, because none of them were fit for war fighting. So ironically, the military itself became interested in reforming a lot of urban issues in England, at least. Anyway. So here's some of the problems: ill education, urban disease, stunted growth, both mental and physical, no education, urban pollution, massive disease scales, urban unrest, urban military recruits were unsuitable. It's just a pile of humans that have been ignored for 50 or 60 years or more in these new, weird, big cities. And normally what happens is the country collapses, and we'll show you that. But that didn't happen, because we now live in these big, originally super tech infrastructural solutions. So good issues of representation and literacy were expanding, but bad examples where all these pollutions were expanding as well, and lack of equality in politics for most of the people. So because of these points, widened, people were debating whether face-to-face or in cheaper industrial paper, and new cafes were existing. Instead of drinking themselves into oblivion, people were drinking coffee, and they were debating issues of the day. And particularly, what do we do about urban sites? What do we do about politics? What's the best economic system? How do we organize a democracy? Or do we go back to kings? Those were the open questions, and nobody knew the answer. And so we now look in the past and said, oh, it had to happen this way. No, it didn't. It didn't have to happen this way at all. We are one particular series of human choices. it could have turned out much worse. It could have been the same Greek tragedy as before, but it wasn't. I want to argue several points. Three main questions started to be asked, as I said. Mostly these were solutions implemented without deep democratization and widespread literacy. There were still elites trying to recover their power. And so super tech really developed in this situation of low representation and attempts to pacify people. If you read the Heberlein, and I reviewed Heberlein, Heberlein is the idea that there's a tech fix. A tech fix doesn't address the human element. So that's why a lot of super tech solutions are tech oriented. A lot of super tech solutions are not about changing people's minds. They're not about changing laws. They're about building a super technology that magically saves you. And this was a reality when most people really couldn't read, and most elites didn't want people to participate. So they built technical fixes that fix things for people without their direct participation or knowledge. And so we've grown up in those situations where everything is in the background, and mostly built in a very unrepresentative way. That's why there's lots of crony contracts in big infrastructural deals, per se. Cree is notorious, I think, for Chaebol getting a lot of crony contracts for development and infrastructural things still to this day. Anyway, all these have UID problems, so it's unintended, indirect, delayed effects of building these things. One of them was urban problems get solved. And when they're solved, then you develop these whole new levels of scale problems that come with solving those problems. And that's where we are today. We're trying, we've solved urban problems, but we've thrown all the waste outside the cities. And now we have to figure out how to deal with more closed loop arrangements of growth and development. We have to solve more than the urban site, in other words. Now we have to solve urban and regional development together across wide territories and not just the urban site. And that's a much taller order of debate. Anyway, because of all of this, by the mid 20th century, many alternative views of technology assessment about the scaled risk that we bees had built into our huge hive. So for 150 years, there was much debate about this super tech world that solved all these problems. But super tech world itself started to create a lot of systemic environmental and social issues. One of them being lack of representation in the plan, and the other one also as being the ecological impact of large-scale infrastructural change. And both of those things caused a new level of desire for different futures, to greater participation, and all the other regions of the future began to be developed really from the 60s and 70s that were mentioned in that book. The three questions for problem solving that start to be asked, this urban question, what do we do? You may find this funny, but a lot of the people that founded the United States, they thought urban problems are going to solve themselves. They said, we want people to die in urban areas. Thomas Jefferson is very clear. He says, I don't want big cities in the United States. Let's let them all die. Let New York die. Let it fall apart. It's better if we live as an agricultural society because cities are sources of massive pollution and democratic corruption. That's the history of the world, they felt. And that's very true. New York's terribly corrupt. Many big cities have been corrupt for over 100 years in the United States. So those things came true, but big city infrastructure is handled. Other people wanted to solve it with more of a communist view, right? Like think of Karl Marx thinking about working class revolution. So you had people that looked into the past for agricultural solutions. They just hoped urban sites would go away, like Thomas Jefferson. Or you had people like Karl Marx that took the side of the working class and felt that they should murder the elites. They felt they should kill people because they're being repressed. And the world that they live in was stealing all of their livelihoods and work. So people debated these things very hotly. And there's lots of assassinations and murders all through the European 1800s and in the late 1800s in the United States over these very issues of how do you address this? Do you use a tech fix or does this require political revolution? So you can read Johnson's The Ghost Map. It really sets the stage for London. And I'll explain why London's so interesting in a minute, because all these things were happening in London. A lot of people didn't believe it was possible to solve these things. And particularly if you're an inbred elite and you'd run a country for hundreds of years, you don't really want to share power with people. You just want to marry other powerful people. And you'll leave the city if it gets polluted and you'll go to your estate in the countryside. And you don't really care because you're not elected. What do you care? So that's the problem, that you had a political elite that didn't really care about these things unless it directly impacted their ability to make money or to live. And eventually it did. That's the story, particularly in London. London's pollution got so bad that it was impossible even for the aristocratic parliament to meet. I mean, there's no elections really in mass franchises in England until after World War II. There's no one person, one vote until literally like 1950s in England. So the point is, they're just ready to move out of London and say, we're just not going to keep our parliament here. It's just too polluted. Let all the Londoners die. If they did that, probably it would be just as bad. And you know, we'd never have a durable British Empire, which may be good. But the point is, the history is they did solve these issues, and those empire solutions were expanded around the world and used by people who didn't have empires. So there was lots of problem solving and super tech solutions that developed out of the London case that I'll show and that I showed in the video. That's why London's so interesting. It became really the experimental site for how do you build these urban infrastructural solutions that change the history of the world. And Johnson's book is very clear that, you know, London really did change the history of the world. It's not just my bias as a native English speaker. I'm looking comparatively that London became the world's largest city ever in world history. And if it didn't solve it, it was going to truly collapse. It was already collapsing. And they felt that their only solution, if they're going to keep their empire, is to keep their capital city. And they were forced to do expensive things that have never been done in world history. And that's what's so fascinating about London and the Ghost Map book. Anyway, the other two questions, a political question, you know, do we keep, you know, the House of Lords, or we just throw them all out and cut off their heads like the French Revolution did? I mean, these were open debates. These were definitely open debates. Economic questions, you know, or do we want private capital, you know, people, individual freedoms, private property, maintaining your individual freedoms, or do we want a state elite to reallocate wealth more equally and control people centrally for supposed good of a whole society? Those were open questions. And this was the invention of the word socialism, the invention of the word communism. This was the invention of the word capitalism even. All these isms were written down and shared as ideals for different people. And all of these things, nobody knew the ultimate outcome. So for some people, they wanted to get to stability. Like, how do we deal with this urban problem? They just want stability and growth. So infrastructure was the tech fix, the tech fixers. They just wanted to solve these things with technology. For others, no, we like this revolutionary condition. We don't want a tech fix. We think it's really good that there's problems because that's going to cause a revolution, and we need a revolution now. So stop trying to fix urban problems. All we need to do is recruit the working class to realize they have to revolt. And so, you know, this is more of the socialist or communist view, that they don't want the elites to solve anything. They want it to generate revolutionary conditions. Then they want to solve it after the revolution, of course. In short, conservatives, revolutionaries, and middle-of-the-road liberals asked the same questions. And they were forced to sort of speak the same language. Even Karl Marx is appealing to what he thinks is science. And he's not just morally outraged. He's trying to make a scientific argument about things with data, however rigged I think it is. But nonetheless, it's a data-based argument. And conservatives use data-based arguments as well. So everybody did not appeal to religion or morality. They started to appeal to this science. And that sort of sets the stage for technology assessment. Like, suddenly there was a wider language of debate about multiple interests on the project. So let me show you the rare scale of big cities, and let me show you what typically always happened in the Greek tragedy that most of world history. So where are the cities of over 1 million, and how long did they last? So the first point, how rare they are. I would say mostly it's state facilitated. Why? Because they're always state capitals. I'll just skip forward. You can have this PowerPoint yourself. Second point, all of these were state political capitals and their networks. There are very few commercial cities. They're mostly the state elite and their consumption and their servants and the bureaucrats around this capital and all of the hangers-on regarding those. Only a few commercial-based cities of 1 million, only about 500 years ago. And these were first in China, by the way. These were not in Europe. However, there was little ongoing awareness of this because there's no such thing as world history. The idea of world history didn't really develop until after World War II. And that means a comparative view of common trends of all civilizations. Previously, there are histories of certain civilizations. There are histories of certain countries, of certain peoples, and their fights with other peoples. But there was not a view that everybody was sharing the same history. And that's what this view is here. So moving on, number 3, we only slightly talk on literacy, and that's not important to this point. But number 4, urban scales were tremendous only in the early 1800s compared to much smaller scales, because certain things began to be solved, and more and more people were larger in urban sites. Particularly European empires were larger than other empires, and that created a context where their capital cities were much larger too. But they had the same Greek tragedy problem. Number 5, I will show how easily large scales of urbanization and even literacy can vanish. So you may think, oh, we're educated now, we'll never lose that. It's always been lost. It's always been lost until the early modern history. Maybe we will be lost, we don't know. But we've solved things before. The issue is, can we solve our other problems right now? So when the state leaves, typically writing can leave, coinage can leave, urban sites can disappear, stability of large trade can disappear. You think trade is neutral. Trade really depends on having common jurisdictions. So a state protects trade routes, and without that larger protection to a capital city, you don't really have an incentive to do large scale trading, and things get very regionalized again. So you see this pulse of larger scales to regionalized scales over history, over a long time. Moreover, I'll show states covered a very small portion of the world. It's estimated only about half of the world's population had a state in around 1800. We like to think, oh, everybody has a state. No, there's places with no states too, and no big cities. So there's lots of frontier zones and tribe groups everywhere around the world. Not just in Africa, but we're talking South America, we're talking in India. There's tribal groups in India, in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, on the edges of lots of empires, all across Melanesia and the Pacific. So let's look at the cities by name now. So historically rare, we can talk about it very quickly in one slide deck. So those 3 questions: urban, political, economic, and scientific. What's the kind of methods we need to look at for analyzing this? So skipping forward, the first one, as you know, Rome probably, which is surprising because Rome is already about 3,000 years into the last 5,000 years of history of urban sites. So there have been cities for 3,000 years before Rome developed the first city in the world of capital, had 1 million people. There have been over 3,500 years of urban history at this point. So all the history of all cities over 1 million started only 2,000 years ago, and it took that long to get that large because Rome was a tremendous empire across the Mediterranean. And the cheap transport through the Mediterranean really helped Rome gain its scale. So the geography, I think, of the Roman Empire really contributed to that. Rome also built a massive road network and had massive literacy. Most European languages are still based on Roman letters, right? We still call them Roman letters for a reason. So those literacies changed, but the languages changed with them. Rome reached that scale only between 0 and 100 CE as Common Era. Saint means AD. But Rome had been in existence for about 800 years. So not all cities survive 800 years, or not all political structures survive 800 years, but Rome did, and it slowly grew and eventually was 1 million people, but it took 800 years to do that. And it's also only after new kinds of systems of information flow. Like instead of, Romans wrote on stone, right? Romans did not have paper. Romans had to carry stones around if they wanted, or memorize things. And but paper came from Egypt, and they were able to develop really the world's first paper-based empire with papyrus. So that really helped information flows and trade and bills and invoices and things like that. Rome was a capital city of 700 years under 1 million. without any papyrus, then Rome began to swell as communications mediums and militarism swelled together. So Rome stayed over 1 million for maybe 400 years, built a lot of interesting infrastructure. A lot of the infrastructure of Rome still exists for archaeologists to look at for how they solve these things, particularly the sewers. Rome had massive central sewers they had to develop. But Rome, if you look at the archaeology and burial sites, Romans are full of parasites all over their bodies. I mean, they find like evidence of bone damage and diseases of parasites. They also, a lot of them had herpes and sexual diseases. So it's just a massive site of disease. They also had a lot of, that's not one of the only reasons, but lead poisoning. They carried water in lead pipes because lead has such a low melting point. You can make lead pipes really easy. But of course, we don't normally want to drink lead for anything because it's a neurotoxin. So for hundreds of years, they're, sexually diseased, parasites all through their bodies, drinking lead. Not a good way to go, right? So only declining below 1 million as the Roman Empire really was split in the 300s, and it finally invaded around 410, really by an invited army. So it's elites fighting elites for Rome, really, instead of barbarians attacking Rome. So once you lose that, Rome quickly quite falls. State-based slavery declines too. A lot of slavery comes in with big empires and states, and when empires disappear, people are literally freed, not metaphorically freed, but they are literally freed because war grabs people from other countries and puts them into, state-based slavery. And so end of states is positive, and a lot of people are freed in this way. But nonetheless, here's the scale of Rome. There's only one city about right here, and it's all this area, one city of 1 million. There's other cities, but think about that. Nowadays, that was bizarre to have only one big city. Imagine going through the Mediterranean and never seeing a city except one, like that scale. Just there are all these tiny little villages everywhere. So that's astounding scale with only one city right here for that. So the next city, a lot of people argue Constantinople, but I don't think it ever reached that. Wasn't ever big as Rome. So what's the next one? Probably Chang'an, and this is a capital city of the Tang Dynasty in the 700s. So it took, and that's also a state-based capital. Tang Dynasty is very big, but as the Tang Dynasty's elite started to fight each other around 750, Chang'an shrinks as well. And so the next one, I think is possible. I don't, look into it if you're curious, but unified Shilla, maybe in Gyeongju. I mean, there's historical pictures and data about Gyeongju. Gyeongju was huge for a world scale. Maybe in the 800s, Gyeongju was very close to 1 million, but nobody really knows. But it's really very much at the end of unified Shilla, right? So big city problems were not really solved by that. Big city problems never got solved by China because China's elite started to fight and the big cities collapsed kind of before that. But maybe unified Shilla, one of its problems was urban scale. Samguk-yusa said Gyeongju's population at its peak in the 800s was this many households. And if a household is 3 or 4, maybe that's 1 million people. This was hardly a systemic or durable scale. Immediately at its peak in the 800s, Shilla and Gyeongju begins to decline. Soon, Shilla is conquered by Goguryeo. Very, literally 1 generation. So if Gyeongju had 1 million, it would only be at this level for less than a generation. However, it's worth mentioning is one of the rare political capitals that reached something near 1 million only after being a unified political capital for 200 years. So, build the state takes 200 years to get to a city of 1 million. That shows how difficult it is to have such scaled populations then. It shows the importance of international trade. Unified Shilla was very much trading with the world, unlike the way Korea isolated itself later in Chosun Dynasty. Anyway, what was the next big city? Anybody look at the recorded lecture? What is next after potentially Chang'an, Gyeongju for the whole world? What's happening around this time? 800s, 900s. as this declines, right? Baghdad, we see the rise of Islam. Islam is expanding from the 500s and 600s. Baghdad becomes the first kind of global capital of the Islamic religion, political capital. Now there is no political capital of Islam. There's multiple states, but there used to be a political capital of this theocratic, global religion. And maybe Baghdad was almost over 1 million. Nobody really knows, trusts the data at that stage, but Baghdad is huge. And a lot of things you can do with a big city, a lot of knowledge. Baghdad was known as a huge city of learning. And of course, everybody in Islam needed to be able to read the book, Muhammad's writings, the Quran. So it encouraged literacy around the world in one language. And so everybody needed to speak and write Arabic letters. And that was a great common thing about Islamic civilization, and still is. So political capital from 600s, but it took several hundred years to get that way. Arabic was really the first global language of religion and trade. And there's no administrative consolidation, highly decentralized. So there was a political capital for a while, but Islam is very decentralized in many other ways and could not keep that sultan in charge of everything. What's next after Baghdad? After Baghdad declines with the political decentralization, anyone want to venture a guess, or what did you see in the video? Yeah. Baghdad reached this already, right? So that consolidated land and land trading. There's also an oceanic trading. So how do you get something that's large again? Pilgrimage to Mecca, all these things are important. So how do you beat that? How do you get something as large as that? I mean, if you can get a little over 1 million, and you still have access to global trade, that's pretty rare to ever see a city of 1 million, right? That means a lot of people are dying and not really breeding and maintaining themselves in a city for that kind of scale, never to get any larger. Cities are always based upon birth rates and death rates. So death rate may have been tremendous in Baghdad. We really don't have a lot of information, I think, about that. But, let's skip forward. I want to move to the very end here. Let's go back to this. So concurrently, Baghdad maybe 2 million, but back in China, the Mongols invade China, and Mongol or Yuan dynasty all across Eurasia. That's how you get bigger than Islam. You have the Mongol dynasties that were over part of Korea, they were over Inner Asia, they were over China, most of northern China, they were over India, they've been into Europe, and they would have gone even further into Europe, but there was the death of Genghis Khan, and the armies that were about to invade Europe went back to the east to see who's going to be the next great Khan. And so, if the great Khan did not die, maybe, Europe would have been integrated also within the Mongol Empire. There's really no stopping them, literally. There's just a lot of forests, but there's really nothing there. Not many Europeans, no cities. So who knows if they really wanted to invade that zone, but they were there. They were in Hungary. Mongols were in Hungary waiting to invade, but they were called back because Genghis Khan had died. So nonetheless, they did have paper block printing, paper money. They had the capacity to have this massive scale, but literally this Mongol and Chinese political capital, that's where the next big cities developed, in this Chinese-centered Mongol dynasty. Hangzhou, near the southern Yangtze River. So right at the edge of the whole trading network of the southern river of China was Hangzhou, and that's where the guy who made Alibaba is from. What's it? Jack Ma. Jack Ma is a commercial guy from Hangzhou. Hangzhou's been a big commercial capital for 800 years in China or more, right on the end of the Yangtze River. So, but it disappears as well as the Yuan dynasty falls apart. Very soon, it falls apart as well. Hangzhou shrinks because it's no longer, you don't have the big state to protect that large scale trade. Also, Kaifeng, the northern Yellow River, may have reached 1 million too. So these are really the first world commercial cities. So Hangzhou and Kaifeng, but they're at the very end of the rivers and they're very beginning of the oceans of China. And this is when China is still an ocean trading world, just like Korea was ocean trading at the time too. But literally after the Mongols are gone, the scale of that trade can't be maintained and these cities get smaller. But a political capital begins in around the Ming dynasty, which was a native Chinese dynasty against the Mongols. But about 50 years after state consolidation in Nanjing, Nanjing is far inland in China. During the same period, the Yongle Emperor built the forbidden city of Beijing. Beijing was a dual capital, but Beijing took another 100 years to get only 1 million. So there were two political capitals, probably both around 1 million from around 1500, but the Ming dynasty is collapsing at that point. So it doesn't survive very long at all. Meanwhile, south of China, a parallel empire in the Siamese, soon after the Ming consolidates in this date, 1344, Siamese consolidate very soon after in the south. They're in between the massive Islamic trade zone and they're in between the big Chinese consolidated Ming dynasty. And so they're kind of a trading empire between both. But, it took 300 years to ever get 1 million, but it declines very soon after 1 million. There's one hypothesis I have that it's just impossible to have a city of 1 million biologically. I mean, we can make arguments for other things like politics creating it, but maybe it's just politically, biologically impossible to have a scale of 1 million people without a centralized system of waste management or representation for a very long time. But there's no way to really test that. You can't roll history back and find the data. Anyway, meanwhile, back in China, political empire of the Qing dynasty, Beijing was the sole political capital, but Beijing declines in the 1800s, only achieved 1 million people in the 1800s, but within 50 years, it can't maintain that. It cannot maintain that. Also, the British are invading. They destroy Beijing. They sack the Summer Palace, which is one of the few places that wasn't destroyed by the Maoist, Cultural Revolution in the 70s. If you ever go to China, try to see the Summer Palace. It's really a tiny window into ancient Chinese empirical history that wasn't destroyed by the 1970s Maoists. Also, capital of Tibet in Lhasa, it was not destroyed. The Maoists almost destroyed that too, but some Maoists protected that. I've seen both. I've been to Tibet myself around 2008, 2009. Very beautiful, very surprising that the Lhasa Potala Palace is still there. It's absolutely beautiful inside. You have no idea because they don't let pictures out. It's stunning how rich elites lived. And we don't really see that because you and I are the product of very secular revolutions that ended all this centralized wealth. So it's just stunning to see that what was lost or how unequal the world was hundreds of years ago. Anyway, so Beijing scale soon gone. In Japan consolidated in 1600. Fresh political capital of Edo. But it took over 100 years to get larger by 1721. And there is really good data from Japan. Japan had a very strong bureaucracy at this point. So Edo and Beijing may have been the only cities in the world with 1 million people from 1700 to early 1800, but they both are going to decline. Edo will continue, but Beijing will decline. In China, Canton, now Guangzhou, expanded from the 1500s. This is in the terminus city of the Portuguese Empire. So another global city, and all it can do is make one city. By the way, at this time, there are no cities of 1 million in Europe at all. Rome was the last one for a long time. So only at the very end point of trading with big China did the Portuguese get one big city of Canton. But Canton and Guangzhou reached by 1 million, 1800. That's 300 years of growth. And the Portuguese Empire is falling apart in the 1800s. So it doesn't survive. Everything starts to fall apart at the same time. In Europe, London was a center now of another global empire, the British Empire. By the early 1700s, it's fighting France, and they fight each other throughout the 1700s. But only after successfully, challenging in 1815, the only other empire, the French Empire, London becomes a political capital really of the planet. That's never really happened before. Islam did a lot, and China did a lot, Mongols did a lot, but they never were really over literally every part of the planet. And that's the phrase of the British Empire, and the empire upon which the sun never set. And by the late 1800s, that was true. The British were in everywhere, but they're a very small island nation. But the point is, city of London was the terminus of all the trade. And so London was really the first globalized city at true global scale, not just to use that phrase global, but really the first globalized scale city. And it had even larger problems than all the other cities that we've seen. London was over 1 million by 1825 for the first time. London was the only city in Europe with 1 million people. London was the first city in Europe with over 1 million since the previous political commercial consolidation of Rome. Skipping forward, Paris. Paris is only 1 million by 1850. So Paris is pretty small for a long time. At the same time, London, while the center of an unchallenged world empire without any global competitors, reached 2 million people by 1850. That documented 2 million is the first time. So literally 170 years ago is the first time we've ever had a city of over 2 million people that we can prove it was really a city of 2 million. And that's bizarre. Why? They're starting to solve urban handling problems. Possibly Baghdad, but we don't have, true good data, I think, for that. However, London continued to grow, and this is the history of the modern world. We think it's just normal to have a city of 10 million. Seoul is officially 10 million. You and I live around Incheon and Seoul, or around this zone, and that's 25 million people. Now we just blink at things like that. That's bizarre. That was the whole population of a global empire 150 years ago. Now one city has these people. How do you handle that? You do have super tech solutions, that's how. So London continued to grow, 4 million in 1875, first time at urban scale in world history. Why? First city to start to solve these urban infrastructural issues. That's why this history of London is so interesting for somebody interested in tech assessment, because they had the wealth, the power, and the political will, and were kind of forced to by revolutionary conditions to have reforms to make urban living more livable for people. But these solutions began to be spread because at this point, there's a lot more shared science publication, there's more international travel, secular trade in the British Empire, what they euphemistically call free trade. So a lot of people could experience London. A lot of other elites were having the same problems around the world, and London's ideas inspired people to think about, it's possible, we can survive this. So on the peripheries, by 1850, Paris is 1 million. 1860, at the start of the US Civil War, New York City was over 1 million, first time. New York City has been there since the 1600s, but it only became a city of 1 million right at the beginning of the US Civil War. By 1875, Berlin, capital of a recently consolidated German empire. Previously, it was called the Germanese, plural little statelets, principalities, duchies. Some places were over archbishops, Archbishop of Salzburg, so the Roman Catholic Church had territory in Germany. So it's all these different little zones, no big cities, but consolidation of a German empire really began in the 1870s, and Berlin becomes quickly a new capital of 1 million. The commercial and political capital of Russian Empire, St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was built by force of will by Peter the Great, as they say, as a way for Russia to trade with the rest of the world through the Baltic Sea. But it took almost 200 years, right, for Russia to even have a city of 1 million. So the political economic capital of the old Austrian Empire at Vienna reached 1 million in 1875 as well. So this is bizarre. Remember the story I've told you is, cities come and go like one at a time. 100 years, nothing. Then one more, and it's here, and it's gone in 50 years. So that's been the history, this pulse of cities disappearing all the time. And suddenly, this one slide showing you, like, there's 5 or 6 cities of 1 million at one time for the world's first time ever, all on the periphery of the British Empire. However, London was 4 million. Paris becomes 2 million in 1875. New York becomes 2 million in 1890. Only the 4th city to do so, perhaps Baghdad, but definitely London, Paris, and New York, making New York City the third largest city in the world. And the size rank here was London first, Paris, and then New York by 1890. New York is 2 million only in 1890. After London did 40 years earlier and Paris did 15 years earlier. Berlin is now 2 million in 1900, though London at the same time reached 6 million. New York was now 4 million. It took Paris. So Paris is getting relatively smaller, and Paris is only 3 million by 1900. So after 1900, modern 20th century, these are the new cities in yellow. Chicago, Moscow, all reaching 1 million. St. Petersburg, Vienna, Shanghai, which is a group European capital, still a big city in modern China. Beijing is not big at this time. Japanese capital Edo, now called Tokyo. London at the time, though, was 6 million, Paris 3 million, New York City 4 million, Berlin 2 million. So those 10 cities were the only examples of cities over 1 million in 1900. That's a handful, right? It's very small, 10. Remember I showed you at the beginning, now there's over 50 cities in the United States by itself that are over 1 million people. So Edo, Tokyo gets larger, 2 million. New York City, commercial capital, gets even larger. 1925, New York City has more people than London. So 100 years ago, New York City is larger than London almost. Osaka, 2 million around 1930 with the Japanese Empire, 3 million in 1930. But it peaks at 3 million in 1940, right before the Japanese Empire's loss in World War II. And now, of course, it's bigger, but that's post-World War II. By 1950, World War II, where the US is the only country not really destroyed, New York City was the largest city in the world. That's why the United Nations went there. That's the world that Frank Sinatra is singing about in the 1950s and 60s. I want to be a part of it, New York, New York. I mean, that's when that song was written, when the world is destroyed and there's one big city of New York and everybody else is building after the war wreckage at 7 million with 12 million in the metropolitan area. Now Seoul is 10 million, even larger, right? War damage, London, only 7 million in 1950. So New York was really the apple, the big apple, as they say. It used to be called the big oyster, but they destroyed all the oysters. Anyway, in 1800, only 3% of the world lived in big cities. So even smaller than 3% lived in cities of 1 million, perhaps less than 1% of the whole world's planet. But it's estimated now, let's skip forward, by 1990s, 47% of the world lived in cities over 1 million. So literally in 200 years, maybe less than 1% of the world's living in urban cities and surviving to half the planet. By 21st century, estimated from 2003, 50% of the world lived in these megacities. So this is another watershed in history where from 2003, we are an urban species living in big super tech infrastructures, increasingly worried about the bad effects of these super tech infrastructures. This is a picture of all the cities of over 1 million from 2006. Remember, 200 years earlier, there's 1. Remember, in 1900, there is 10. So that's a very fast growth. You have to deal with all these issues. I won't go through the quiz. There's a little quiz I have on that, but listen, we have to deal with these issues. There's still massive issues growing around the world. The same urban problems are happening. This is boat houses in Lagos, Nigeria. This is Cape Town in South Africa. It might as well be, Northern England in 1790. I mean, this is what people lived like in Europe 200 years ago. This is favelas or slum areas of Rio in Brazil. So I want to have one last slide here that I think is very important. It takes us to the present. So for big city problems have been solved in a limited way, created all these second order problems, as I said. We solved water treatment for big cities, right? So big cities were clean, but all the waste for big cities go downstream. Energy. Energy is solved. You put electrical generation, so you're not putting smoke in the cities. Electrical dynamos were invented in the 1870s and 80s. So you could have electricity, which was a cleaner way to deliver power. So that cleaned up urban air, but you had big coal-fired power plants sending those clean energy to the city. So you raise the pollution outside the city while kind of clearing it a bit. This is before automobiles in the city too. Transport, electricity was solving a lot of urban problems of horses and horse dung throughout all the world's cities as the only really human transport. But the rise of gasoline, the rise of other things really brought a new level of pollution there as well. Wastes, you had to develop sewer systems. There's videos that I highlighted in the recorded lecture, talk about London building the world's first modern sewer system. And you don't have any plan, you're experimenting. You hope it's going to work, and most of it's still there. But it puts pollution outside the city. Medics disease, medical science consolidated empires, but also solved big city diseases. But nobody really cared about rural areas as much, unless it was part of an empire. So nonetheless, we've perfected urban living, but we haven't perfected regional sustainability. Where does all this waste go? Rural areas, peripheral areas, powerless areas, downstream and into the ocean. We'll talk about the ocean later when I get to the EIA section. There's a lot of pollution in the ocean now, and it's mostly big urban living wastes. So these mass manufacturing externalities, all the shoes, clothing, food, all this was very important. Pasteur figured out how to make large-scale animal populations survive. Louis Pasteur invented the germ theory of disease and went around the world trying to stop sheep from dying, trying to stop cows from dying, trying to keep wine from spoiling, trying to keep beer from spoiling. He isolated a lot of bacteria. So pasteurization really is the process of making commodities last. So you can build a huge amount of food to feed these big cities. But it also, the effects was Pasteur began industrial agriculture and industrial animal raising. Without Pasteur, you would not have had the ability to solve these biological problems of big amounts of sheep, big amounts of cows. They would all just die. So the rise of big cities was needing big food, so to speak. And Supertech big food solutions came with Pasteur. But there's also bad effects of having Supertech big animals, large plantations of different bananas have huge ecological problems, create their own diseases. But for 100 years, that's been the solution. More and more industrial agriculture, more and more industrial urbanization. But these things are now a toxic soup that we are creating. So we've been successful. We've fixed agriculture to solve big city problems. We've fixed urban sites, but we polluted the planet. Ta-da! Congratulations. Your ancestors were very successful. Now we have to fix what they screwed up. Or we're going to end it. I think we're not going to be able to survive this way unless we find some way to handle all of the waste that have come from urban sites and fix agricultural problems at the same time as an urban and regional development. So I think that's where we need to do. We need to, this past Supertech success, we are now in the process of solving all these material externalities outside of and caused by consolidated urban space, caused by agricultural consolidation. We live in a very unique time. Post World War II, we're the really first global level civilization to ever reach this level of problem solving. Nobody has reached these problems before. Previously, there were only problem solving in big cities and in big agriculture. And those were solved sort of together. First big cities and sort of simultaneously big agriculture was allowed. Yet, now we have a problem solving the whole world's externalities. Externalities are the social and ecological costs of private business. That are not paid by the consumer, they're paid by everybody equally. Pollution of the air is an externality because it's paid by everybody equally. It damages everybody equally. You can try to escape it, but it's very hard. Pollution of all kinds of water systems gets more and more expensive. So we're now swimming in our own waste from successful urban and agricultural solutions of the past. And that's where we are now, I think. That we've solved urban centralization, solved agricultural consolidation, how to do it, but UID, unintended, indirect, delayed effects of solving these urban effects, UID of solving for industrialized agriculture has created the problems we're in now. And that's really where we're at. I think we have to end up rethinking a lot of the ways our materials flow, more than just solving, a problem for the short term. We have to think about long-term cycles now. Otherwise, who knows what will happen? Big cities have always collapsed. We postponed that, I would say. We postponed that for 150 years, but now the bill is due. The bill is coming due, and we have to find out much better ways of organizing ourselves, or who knows what will happen. I think we have the ability to do it. The issue is politics and organization, I think. Will we have the politics to do it? I think that's a big, big issue.